Democratic Party leadership in the House and the Senate has to go. And the leaders in the states have to get active or they have to go. And the first who can go is Gavin Newsom. You're out. I'll get to him in a moment. During a pit stop at the Indianapolis 500 car race in 1981, some methanol was sprayed into and on driver Rick Mears and his crew, and suddenly there was literally an invisible fire. Methanol flame does not produce smoke. It is virtually invisible in sunlight. Rick Mears and his crew were on fire, and nobody could see it. Literally, invisible fire. People thought perhaps they were kidding. Right now, this nation is on fire. Also an invisible fire. And Democratic leadership is saying, no, it isn't. Because Hakeem Jeffries and Gavin Newsom and the others can't effing see it. Or because they personally are not yet on fire. Yet. Because Trump hasn't gotten to them yet to set them on fire. Axios reports that Jeffries, the minority whip Katherine Clark, and Caucus chair Pete Aguilar, the top three Democrats in the House, summoned a dozen rank-and-file members to what was called a Come to Jesus meeting about the disruptions during Trump's I'm God right speech last week. You're thinking Jeffries and Clark and Aguilar should have been awarding the disruptors medals of some kind or maybe scolding them for not disrupting enough? No, sir. Leadership is, quote, very unhappy that congressmen and congresswomen who see the invisible fire consuming our nation had the audacity to react to it. Reps like Jasmine Crockett, Maxwell Frost, Maxine Dexter of Oregon, Melanie Stansbury of New Mexico. You had a lot of nerve. Straying from our plan, Jeffries told them, and reminded them of his Dear Colleague letter he sent them before the speech, insisting on a, quote, strong, determined, and dignified Democratic presence in the chamber, and how they violated that by making themselves the story. Seriously. If Hakeem Jeffries thinks limiting protests to holding up those pathetic little signs that they all had, and to what was called, quote, outfit coordination and refusal to clap, unquote, if he thinks that was a sign of strength, or that it was determined, or that it was somehow dignified, he should be marched out of the House chamber faster than Al Green was, and in fact, Jeffrey should be marched out of the House chamber by Democrats. They are not being talked to like they are children, one Democrat leaked to Axios for a story that made the protesters look like children. We are helping them understand why their strategy is a bad idea. I think I've just located the source of the problem here. Their strategy is not a bad idea. Given that their strategy is, unlike the one apparently dreamed up by Hakeem Jeffries, an actual strategy. While the one dreamed up by Hakeem Jeffries is holding up signs the size of ping-pong paddles and not offending the dictator nor angering his Republican slave masters in the House. It doesn't surprise me leadership is very upset. They gave specific instructions not to do that, one anonymous Democrat said, showing exactly the lack of courage Trump is counting on, Trump will count on, Trump has always counted on. Would they have ever done that to Nancy Pelosi? You know the answer, never. So you've got to put the hammer down. Yes, put the hammer down. Put the hammer down right on top of that anonymous Democrat's head. F him. Or her. F them. The country is on fire. And Trump is doing his best, well, Putin's best, to next set the world on fire. And Hakeem Jeffries is worried about making sure his Democrats in the House are absolutely consistent in doing absolutely nothing about it. Invisible fire everywhere, and he has become a living meme. It's fine, he says, from the table, sipping his coffee. And by the way, you invoked Nancy Pelosi to encourage this silent appeasement, this obeying in advance. What did Nancy Pelosi do again after Trump's last State of the Union address in 2020? She tore up her copy of his speech on camera, slowly and methodically. And do you remember that? Or do you remember the Democratic response speech that followed Trump's State of the Union in 2020? Or who gave that speech? Or what that speech was about? I understand that Democratic lawmakers are hamstrung. They don't know what to do at the moment. Democracy seems to be a bad campaign basis. They only have a few options at this point. They could literally act outside of the law. I suppose, since bribes by foreigners are no longer going to be investigated anywhere, you could get foreign billionaires to buy Republicans to vote to impeach Trump. I mean, it's one Republican, Michael. What could it cost? $10 million? You could go a little bit more immediately and more direct. You could interrupt fascist rallies like Trump's next verbal version of Mein Kampf with, I don't know, reasons to evacuate the area in which the speech is being given. That's probably contraindicated. Democratic leadership and Democrats could act symbolically and metaphorically and maybe get themselves punished inside the House, or maybe even arrested by, getting up and leaving with Al Green when he is escorted out, or going along with the progressives who sang "We Shall Overcome," while this latest crazy Republican Speaker Mike Johnson read out Green's censure motion. Or, if they're not willing to do any of that, they can do whatever the hell Hakeem Jeffries thinks he's doing. And I'm really not sure what holding up little paddles that make them all look like Wile E. Coyote in the Roadrunner cartoons with his signs reading "Help" and "That's all, folks" does. But I believe the technical term for what he's doing is, I think this is the technical term, nothing. While the nation burns. Invisibly. By the way, Andy Ogles, an insane man who represents Insane County, is pushing privileged motions to remove all the protesting Democrats from their committee assignments. And if Hakeem Jeffries votes for those resolutions, I would only be mildly surprised. Because, of course, 10 Democrats in the House, elected as Democrats by Democratic voters, they voted with the Republicans to censure Al Green. And they did this because, bluntly, these 10 Democrats are assholes. Amy Barra, asshole. Ed Case, asshole. Jim Costa, asshole. Laura Gillen, asshole. Jim Himes, asshole. Chrissy Houlihan, asshole. Marcy Kaptur, asshole. Jared Moskowitz, asshole. Marie Glusenkamp Perez, asshole. And Tom Suozzi, asshole. In fact, here's another asshole to take home with you. Some of those are not actually surprises. Suozzi is nothing more than a weather vane, and a mediocre one. Marie Perez, too. It's a shame about Jared Moskowitz. He's useful. He was great against Comer. He's funny, and if he apologizes, I would say he gets a second chance. It's a shame Marcy Kaptur wants to end her career siding with Nazis. But there you go. Out. All of them. Out. And if he doesn't figure out that the country is on fire, Jeffries, out. Because what Jeffries should be doing is threatening to shut the goddamn House of Representatives down if any of those measures to throw those dozen or so Democrats who sang off their committees passes. Walk out before the CR vote. Let the Republicans destroy themselves and Trump and the economy. With no Democrats in the House. Get yourself arrested if need be, Hakeem. Do something. Christ, at least hold that weekly news conference every Sunday morning just to steal the narrative away from Trump. It's a meaningless press conference. It's a manipulation of the media. At least you could do that. Are you good at anything? Risk something. Risk as much as that old man from Texas with the cane risked. And the members of the Black Caucus who sang risked. I mean, God damn it, Jeffries. Last month, Jim McGovern of Massachusetts suggested there was a constitutional crisis and that the response should be, quote, maybe a national strike. Saturday, he held a town hall in Holliston, Mass., and he brought it up again. A national strike. We can't just sit back and let our democracy just fall apart, says Congressman McGovern. And I can imagine Jeffries' response to that. We're not letting it fall apart. We have outfit coordination. We have our cute little auction house bidder paddles with strong words written on them, but not too strong. The inside, off-the-record response from the Democrats, from the leadership, from the old, wise men and women of the party is that the Democrats just haven't coordinated a strategy of response to all this yet. Still flat-footed after the election. The election was 126 days ago. In that time, Trump has given a line-item budget veto to a white supremacist, and he's given your personal info to a stoned narcissist. He's dangled the prospect of war against Canada, Panama, Mexico, and Denmark. He has imperiled Ukraine and all of Europe. He has followed Putin's instructions to the letter. He has begun the process of staying in office past his expiration date. What he has not yet broken, he has threatened to break. Hakeem Jeffries has bought pickleball paddles and coordinated outfits and yelled at the only Democrats actually merely doing something symbolic. Out! Get him out of here! And the others. Ordinarily, you wait for the Vichy government to take shape after the Hitler has defeated the France. Hakeem Jeffries has already surrendered. Al Green for Democratic House Leader. Or bring back Nancy and start tearing shit again. By the way, the answer to the trivia question was that the year Nancy tore up the copy of Trump's speech was 2020, and the Democratic response was by Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, and it had an audience, and I had to go look it up. When you have nothing but symbolism, do the symbolism. No to Hakeem Jeffries, yes to Nancy Pelosi, and no, not to Gavin Newsom as the new face of the Democratic Party. Not at all. I'm not as shocked as many were that he's suddenly uncertain about transgendered scholastic athletes. The whole issue, all sides of it, whereas it has taken on tragic and meaningful proportions, it is not, in fact, gigantic. There might be in this country 150 students, high school, college, to whom this applies. If the amount of time spent on this issue were devoted to the amount of time that would be required to resolve each of these situations inside the league or the organization in which they are unfolding, they could have been solved in about 2 weeks. Because it's not about transgendered athletes, Gavin. It's not about whether or not it's fair to the girls. They don't give a damn about girls' sports. They're going to eliminate them next month. Gavin Newsom did not surprise me with that. He surprised me with something else. He really didn't surprise me with anything because I met Kimberly Guilfoyle 20 years ago when she was trying to get a show at MSNBC when Newsom was still mayor of San Francisco and Kimberly Guilfoyle was still Gavin Newsom's wife. And my only thoughts were, this is his wife? That's who he married? This idiot? And the other thought was the dialogue from the movie The Graduate, when the old guy, Mr. McGuire, at the graduation party has that conversation, that career advice with Dustin Hoffman, and he says, I want to say one word to you, just one word. And Dustin Hoffman, as Benjamin, says, yes, sir. And Mr. McGuire says, Are you listening? And Benjamin says, yes. Yes, I am. And Mr. McGuire says, plastics. Newsom has given me another one of those first moments, not the plastics moments, but, he married this idiot. Newsom did a podcast with Charlie Kirk. That's where the quote about transgendered athletes comes from. And he agreed with Charlie Kirk that there's an issue with transgendered athletes. He agreed with Charlie Kirk. Racist, sexist, monstrous Charlie Kirk. To what point? To try to get the vote from that vast middle out there? The middle between what, Gavin? Nazis who want to kill all the non-Nazis and Nazis who merely want to imprison all the non-Nazis? Is that your wheelhouse for the nomination in 2028? And then it turned out, at least according to Kirk, that the podcast was arranged by Kim Guilfoyle. Kirk told the Fox station in L.A., quote, I got a phone call from Governor Newsom 2 weeks ago. We connected through Kimberly Guilfoyle. Obviously, they have a shared past. So not only are you still working with Kirk, but you reached out via Kim Guilfoyle because Lara Trump was unavailable? Alina Habba wouldn't take your call? Kirk had another quote. This is another non-surprise. This is a guy who wants to be president more than any other human being alive. Well, that's not true. There's still Trump. But Gavin, if Kirk's right, my advice to you is this. Get J.D. Vance to resign. Get Trump to appoint you vice president, because even today, even now, to get the Democratic nomination for president, you have to have a minimum of one scruple. Just one. I mean, here is where we are in this country. Josh Marshall's site, TPM, has gotten an email from management at the U.S. African Development Foundation to the White House Presidential Personnel Office about the appointment of the acting chair of the foundation's board. Seems like trivia, seems like legalese, and it, in fact, is the next thing they're going to do to destroy the country. It gets around the reality that, in this case, Trump's choice could never get confirmed by the Senate for this acting chair or full-time chair of the foundational board. So the foundation's solution, memorialized in an email to the White House Presidential Personnel Office, is very simple. The foundation's solution and Trump's: end Senate confirmation of presidential appointments. This email begins, quote, given the president's inability to supervise the activities of the board, less USADF, he has inherent authority, those are the key words, inherent authority to designate an acting chairman of the board. And it ends, quote, the president currently has no way of ensuring the agency is running or complying with his executive order unless he directs an temporary official using inherent authority under Article 2. Bingo. You heard me. The next Trump maneuver will be that Senate approval of his appointments is unconstitutional according to the inherent authority in Article 2. President be king. Advise and consent this. Eliminate just restraints on Trump? No. Also eliminate criticism of him and questions to him. Eliminate the slightest protest by the outside world, whether it is Al Green swinging his cane or Akeem Jeffries swinging his bat with the paddle ball attached to it by string, or just some senator asking a question about who this idiot is he wants to appoint to run the board of the USADF. And that's another reason why Al Green's mid-speech protest was so essential. Trump long ago figured out that the easiest way to avoid criticism was to avoid critics. Keep the critics out of your rallies, out of your speeches, out of your cabinet, out of your party, out of your site. But there's one hole in that wall. You can't keep them out of your speeches to Congress. Democrats at Trump speeches and the media at Trump events are literally the last people in this country, the last handful of people who pierce Trump's bubble in the slightest. Al Green voiced opposition and criticism, and Trump almost imperceptibly has moved from being convinced he has overwhelming support to convincing himself he has nothing but support, to convincing himself that he has a complete mandate and is already king, to never even hearing any more criticism, to punishing the critics, to making critics and criticism of him illegal. That is the path. That's why the individual boycotts of his speech to Congress a week ago were well-intentioned but stupid. That's why even the little ping-pong ball paddles were better. That's why Democratic leadership should have walked out with Al Green, not warned others never to do anything again without written permission of Hakeem Jeffries. Most of them are of, at best, dubious value as elected congressmen and senators, utterly fungible. Several buildings full of Tom Swazis. But as the last Americans allowed to literally speak truth to power, their job is to interrupt Trump. Their job is to interrupt his feedback loop. Their job is to shake him and enrage him and provoke him. Their job is to use their right to shout catcalls from the congressional peanut gallery until Trump eliminates the congressional peanut gallery by eliminating Congress. They have to do this because when he eliminates Congress, all we will have left is the media. And I know it's a surprise to you that we still have media. I wouldn't have noticed either. Funniest doggone thing. Trump announced he was going to get tough on Russia and there'd be sanctions on Russia and he would pressure Russia to settle with Ukraine. And then he cut off Ukraine's access to U.S. satellite imagery. And then the Russians doubled the amount of bombs they were dropping onto Ukraine. And then the accuracy of those drops suddenly doubled to as if they were getting locations and other targeting information from American companies. And then NBC reported yesterday that even if Zelensky signs a rare earth deal today, that does not mean Trump will restore American aid to Ukraine. He wants Zelensky to move towards resigning and holding elections. And yes, Trump's people have been caught talking to the opposition parties in Ukraine, you know, the ones favored by Putin. Oh, and yes, he signs the rare earths and minerals deal and cedes all the territory Russia wants. And after all that, the media is still reporting that Trump is going to get tough on Russia about Ukraine and there'll be sanctions on Russia. And he's pressuring Russia because the media now sucks. The only people who have not been muzzled or self-muzzled are the ones who are too stupid to do the job well in the first place. And just when you are ready to give up on these idiots, you remember, oh my God, they are idiots, but they are our idiots, and they are the only idiots we have left. And you remember that Trump hates them more than we do. Only he is hunting them now. I got scoffing blowback from last Thursday's podcast, especially the title, Trump's plan to make it illegal to criticize him and his junta. And I'd like to apologize for that title because it wasn't strong enough. The title should have been Trump's plan to make it illegal to criticize him and his junta, and the media is collaborating so fast it may happen before summer.
Mr. President, since you last spoke about it yesterday, some details have come out about your cabinet meeting with Elon Musk and some clashes potentially between Secretary Rubio and Secretary
No
Duffy.
clash. I was there. You're just a troublemaker. And you're not supposed to be asking that question because we're talking about the World Cup. Elon gets along great with Marco, and they're both doing a fantastic job. There is no clash.
But Mr. President, bottom line,
Who are you with?
NBC.
No wonder. That's
Mr. President,
NBC.
who has more authority, Elon Musk or your cabinet secretary?
Any other questions about the World Cup?
Can we unveil the truth?
I can't imagine why Trump got away with telling a reporter you're not supposed to ask that question. Maybe it's because when he expelled the Associated Press from the White House, not one other news organization, not one, did anything about it. Nobody did a thing, even when simple self-defense should have told the White House Correspondents Association to walk out en masse that day. And maybe it's because when the White House Correspondents Association did not walk out en masse that day, Trump knew he could take away its right to select the pool reporters, and they again would not walk out en masse when he did that. He could threaten them with expulsion from the White House the way you just heard him do it to the NBC guy just there without saying it, just by implying it. And knowing the White House Correspondents Association would do nothing, he also knew he could do that to Mr. NBC reporter there because Vichy Joe Scarborough and Mrs. Vichy Joe went to Mar-a-Lago and begged for what passes for their pathetic professional lives, and he knew he could do that to NBC going forward because NBC immediately spun off MSNBC as fast as they could file the business paperwork, and MSNBC then fired or demoted all of its hosts of color, and Trump would never have to explicitly threaten NBC ever again. Okay, maybe he'd have to threaten them again once.
Frankly, what Nicole Wallace said, I've never been a fan of hers, and she's not very talented. But I'll tell you, what she said the other day about that young man is disgraceful. She should be forced to resign. And Rachel Maddow should be forced to resign. Nobody watches her anyway. I don't know if it's not possible they pay her as much money as I hear, but certainly she's lost all credibility, both of them. But what they said the other day, they should be forced to resign.
Thank you again, Joe Scarborough. Joe Scarborough is, as H.L. Mencken would have phrased it, not worth the oil with which to fry him in hell. You know my criticisms of Rachel Maddow. 10 million Joe Scarboroughs are not worth one Rachel Maddow. I'm sure, though, when push comes to shove, NBC will defend her and Wallace and its White House reporter, or that guy who is probably by now its ex-White House reporter, and not the shady ex-congressman who has gone from Trump critic to Trump sanitizer to would-be Trump vice president to never-Trumper to welcomer of Trump insect overlords, and has done all this in literally 1 decade. Laws against deepfakes that can be converted into laws against anti-Trump videos. Laws against campus protests, nominally about the Middle East, that can be converted into laws against campus protests about him. And the saddest part is none of these refined laws directed at the media, directed at protest, may be necessary because the media will have killed itself first. Quote, I am a member of several Tesla owner forums where widespread reports of similar attacks are being shared. Begins a post at a Facebook site, username Mike Miller. Who knows if it's real? Copying a letter he claims to have sent to his California Congressman Garamendi. Quote, owners are facing physical threats, vandalism, and intimidation simply because of their vehicle choice. Reports in the media highlight incidents of Tesla charging stations being burned, Tesla service centers being vandalized, and Tesla vehicles being spray painted or otherwise damaged. Unfortunately, law enforcement often has limited ability to hold perpetrators accountable. By the way, certainly that's not because the perpetrators got away in their Tesla vehicles. This is not just an issue of property damage. It is an issue of safety and targeted aggression. I urge you to consider legislative action that would increase penalties for these acts, potentially classifying them as hate crimes or enhancing legal consequences for individuals who engage in such behavior. You heard him. Hate crimes. He wants, and again, it could be a troll. Everybody who responded to him wasn't a troll. Everybody who said, yes, let's make it a hate crime. He wants any damage to a Tesla vehicle or a facility, or especially a Cybertruck, prosecuted as a hate crime. This is how far the madness of America 2025 has gone. Protections for transgendered people erased, and the debate over it endorsed by the governor of California, who claims to be a Democrat and is still talking to that crazy woman Guilfoyle. Protections for transgendered people erased. The history of violence against blacks erased from government websites. Libraries closed. History whitewashed. The interruption of a presidential speech, which is a Republican invention, incidentally, interrupting a presidential speech, bringing censure and possible removal from committees, and 10 Democrats supporting it. But if somebody writes F you Musk with their finger on the dust on the back of your Cybertruck, that should be a hate crime. Problem, of course, is what under hate crime statutes could you charge Musk with when he blows up another one of his own rockets like last week? Sadly, we go from the ridiculous to the sublime. The New York Times has published a massive history of Sullivan, the Supreme Court case with which it was involved, that is the protection for almost all journalistic investigations of and criticisms of elected officials and prominent public figures. The essence of Sullivan is that to be guilty of defamation or libel, a news organization has to be proved to be guilty of actual malice, knowingly printing falsehoods designed to damage a public or governmental figure. After a laudable but probably way too detailed history of the ruling, the Times finally gets around to the shattering conclusion, paragraph 9,000 or so, that there are already 2 Supreme Court justices willing to hear a case that could repeal Sullivan, Gorsuch and Thomas, and all you need is 2 more, and Sullivan will be relitigated by an utterly compromised court, a Supreme Court that is itself a constitutional crisis. Worse still, the Times piece concludes that the likeliest plaintiff in such a case would be Trump. That his frivolous lawsuits against CNN and the ABC Stephanopoulos case about his quoting of the word rape and the stupid CBS lawsuit about the 60 Minutes interview of Kamala Harris, those are actually attempts on Trump's behalf, or maybe by him, if he's sane for an hour, to get one of his lawsuits in front of his Supreme Court to overturn Sullivan. And again, not exactly being secretive about it. No stealth here. After he lost his 2022 defamation case against CNN, Trump appealed last year, and his lawyers wrote, quote, "Plaintiff respectfully requests that the court revisit the actual malice standard under New York Times v. Sullivan." New York Times v. Sullivan? Maybe that means they're going to try to repeal New York Times v. Sullivan. No, it's not possible. If Sullivan disappeared, how much of the already terrified American news media run by shithead billionaires would disappear with it? How shaky is the ground on which Sullivan stands? Well, if you'd really like to not sleep tonight, the Times notes that 32 years ago, an academic paper was written by an assistant law professor at a Midwestern university which questioned the broadness of Sullivan, which questioned especially how much it limited non-governmental public figures from suing news outlets for damage, how it could someday, if left to its own devices, tabloidize mainstream news, even though, even 32 years ago, that had long since happened. The assistant professor with the 1993 doubts about Sullivan is still a prominent legal figure in 2025. Her name is Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan. And unless she's changed her mind, we're all in a boatload of trouble. Also of interest here, and speaking of which, Gavin Newsom embraces Charlie Kirk, and Stephen A. Smith, sorry, that's President Stephen A. Smith, ask him, he's reluctant to run, but ask him if he's going to run and make the great sacrifice. Gavin Newsom embraces Charlie Kirk, and Stephen A. President Smith embraces Candace Owens. And that sound you heard is not the Overton window shifting. It's the Overton window being dropped by the movers and shattering into a million pieces on the effing floor. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
Still ahead on this edition of Countdown, the newspaper The Columbus Dispatch notifies us that Thurber House, the museum, former Thurber family home, the literary nonprofit operation supporting writers and perpetuating the work of America's most versatile humorist and satirist, is in financial trouble. Needs $200,000 to keep going, in large part because fewer and fewer people know who James Thurber was. I have done my best to keep him prominent. We had a brief resurgence when I used to read his stories on TV, but here I have failed him. I haven't done one Thurber story since we switched to 2 podcasts a week, so in hopes that you will help bring him front of mind again, I will bring you today not just 1 but 2 Thurbers, and not just 2 Thurbers, but my favorite Thurber and my late father's favorite Thurber story. Fitting, since this Thursday it will have been 15 years since my father died, and I was reading it to him when he died. Now, honestly, it went better than that sounds. James Thurber forever. First, believe it or not, there's still more new idiots to talk about. The roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's other worst persons in the world. And this episode is dedicated to the new rule they are experimenting with in baseball spring training, the automatic balls and strikes system, in which a batter, catcher, or pitcher can appeal the umpire's ball or strike call, and you get a computerized review in like 15 seconds on the scoreboard. I like it. It's terrific. But I think they may have to change the name because it's already known by its acronym. It is the ABS system, which, if you were mean-spirited, and I am, you could alter your pronunciation of that and simply call it ABS system. Fix the acronym. Anyway, here are the nominees. The bronze worst, once again, Stephen A. Smith. I hope he has learned that getting into politics means more than putting your fingers to your lips pensively and trying to look serious, but I don't think so. ESPN is giving him reportedly a 5-year, $100 million new contract, and cool, I am all for the talent having the money and the owners not having the money. Should have held out for $101 million, my friend. But part of this deal will allow Stephen to talk even more politics in venues other than ESPN. And I swear to you, when I was at ESPN, I insisted that I would not and should not be allowed to do, and nobody else should be allowed to do, politics in other venues while doing sports at ESPN. Don't, and I didn't. We did this at MSNBC and on NBC Football Night in America years ago, ending in 2009, 2010, and basically that was the last time it didn't end in utter disaster. Even before that, Rush Limbaugh tried it, and it ended in utter disaster, and it ended in utter disaster at ESPN. This, with Stephen A., will end in tears, especially if Stephen lets himself get played like a $2 banjo every time he steps into the arena. This is him about an interview guest on one of his podcasts. Quote, and I'll spare you my impression of him. When that young lady speaks, don't even think about challenging her intelligence. Don't even think about challenging her ability to articulate her point of view. You better know what the hell you're talking about when you come at her. That's what I take away just as much as anything else. You get the idea that Stephen is paid by the word. I can't wait until she and I sit face to face one day and volley back and forth about what we feel, what we believe, what we stand for, and why, because I'm certainly different than her when it comes to some political position she's taken and beyond. There is no doubt about that, but I can't deny she's sharp as a tack, and you damn well better be if you're going to come for her, because, ladies and gentlemen, this went on for another 17 days. Who is she? Who is he talking about? Who is the she in this equation? Candace Owens. Candace effing Owens. The woman that the fascist site The Daily Wire fired because they said she was too anti-Semitic even for them. Candace effing Owens, who 10 years ago was writing about, quote, the batshit crazy antics of the Republican Tea Party, and then she discovered the real money was being one of the batshit crazy Republican Tea Party. Stephen, if you want to cover politics or run for office, pro tip, take some of that $100 million and buy a guide dog. The runner-up, worser, Elon. I'm just going to quote Politico about Musk here. Elon Musk defended himself to a room full of House Republicans, saying that he can't bat 1,000 all the time, according to 4 people present for his remarks. Okay, I realize Elon is an immigrant, possibly an immigrant who gamed the system and the laws and has no right to be here. I don't know. And he probably was impaired when he said that, so he doesn't exactly get, America or American things like baseball. But let me revisit that one phrase in there where he said he, quote, can't bat 1,000 all the time. In point of fact, to bat 1,000, to have a baseball batting average of 1,000, that is 1.000, that means you are batting 1,000 all the time. It means you did not make any outs, no mistakes, nothing but hits. There are no degrees of batting 1,000. If you don't bat 1,000 all the time, you are instead batting 989 or something. Because the world divides into just 2 categories, Elon. Batting 1,000 and not batting 1,000. And guess which category you fall into, you twerp. Also, Elon is not batting 989 or something. He's batting about 091. But our winner, the worst, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Christopher Luxon. Now, New Zealand used to have a thoughtful, brilliant, brave, humane, though sometimes unintelligible because of that accent, Prime Minister named Jacinda Ardern. Now it has a bald right-winger named Luxon. New Zealand's senior envoy to the United Kingdom, former head of their Labour Party, Phil Goff, got up at an event in London after Trump started his war crimes against Zelensky and Ukraine, and Mr. Goff compared what Trump did to what the British government and Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and the then outsider Winston Churchill did after Chamberlain sold out Czechoslovakia to Hitler at Munich in 1938. Mr. Goff said, quote, President Trump has restored the bust of Churchill to the Oval Office, but do you think he really understands history? Goff then quoted Churchill to Chamberlain and his government in Parliament after the infamous war-starting betrayal of Czechoslovakia. Quote, you had the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, yet you will have war. New Zealand's Foreign Minister Winston Peters, who turns 80 next month and is the head of New Zealand First, immediately fired Mr. Goff. His Prime Minister, Luxon, who he did not inform of the firing, backed him up. Why did they fire Goff? Because diplomats are supposed to talk diplomatically. It sounds like Mr. Luxon could be running the Democratic Party in this country. Anyway, before he became Prime Minister of New Zealand, Luxon was on the Unilever Company executive ladder where he rose to the position of, I swear this is true, he was director of the global deodorants and grooming category. All right, which part of that sounds the most embarrassing? And what do you do for the company here? I'm in charge of grooming. What do you do for the company here? I'm in charge of global deodorants. All the deodorants in the world. I know, that's more of an Australian accent. I apologize, New Zealand. Now, this is bad enough. Goff is quoting Winston Churchill, is pointing out reality, and is doing what real political leaders are supposed to do, giving a middle finger to despots like Donald Trump, and they fired him for making New Zealand diplomatic efforts look bad in England. But just to add to this, he was fired for doing what I did after the Trump ambush of Zelensky, quoting Winston Churchill, and you had the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, yet you will have war. So I'm taking this personally, bro. New Zealand's Prime Minister Christopher, you need more global deodorants because your spit does too stink. Luxon, today's other worst person in the world! As I've mentioned many times, I read this story first aloud in a class in college in 1979, and a friend of mine came up to me and said, "You should forget that sportscasting thing. You should read Thurber for a living." And I said, "Yeah, that'll ever happen." This is, for some reason, salvation for me, catharsis, and every other emotion that is appropriate after it has been a long week. A Box to Hide In by James Thurber. I waited till the large woman with the awful hat took up her sack of groceries and went out, peering at the tomatoes and the lettuce on her way. The clerk asked me what mine was. "Have you got a box?" I asked. "A large box? I want a box to hide in." "You want a box?" he asked. "I want a box to hide in," I said. "What do you mean?" he said. "You mean a big box?" I said I meant a big box, big enough to hold me. "I haven't got any boxes," he said. "Only cartons that cans come in." I tried several other groceries, and none of them had a box big enough for me to hide in. There was nothing for it but to face life out. I didn't feel strong, and I'd had this overpowering desire to hide in a box for a long time. "Oh, what do you mean you want to hide in this box?" one grocer asked me. "It's a form of escape," I told him. "Hiding in a box. It circumscribes your worries and the range of your anguish. You don't see people either." "How in the hell do you eat when you're in this box?" asked the grocer. "How in the hell do you get anything to eat?" I said I had never been in a box and didn't know, but that would take care of itself. "Well," he said finally, "I haven't got any boxes, only some pasteboard cartons that cans come in." It was the same every place. I gave up when it got dark and the groceries closed and hid in my room again. I turned out the light and lay on the bed. You feel better when it gets dark. I could have hid in a closet, I suppose, but people are always opening doors. Somebody would find you in a closet. They would be startled, and you'd have to tell them why you were in the closet. Nobody pays attention to a big box lying on the floor. You could stay in it for days, and nobody'd think to look in it, not even the cleaning woman. My cleaning woman came the next morning and woke me up. I was still feeling bad. I asked her if she knew where I could get a large box. "How big a box you want?" she asked. "I want a box big enough for me to get inside of," I said. She looked at me with big, dim eyes. There's something wrong with her glands. She's awful, but she has a big heart, which makes it worse. She's unbearable. Her husband is sick, and her children are sick, and she is sick too. I got to thinking how pleasant it would be if I were in a box now and didn't have to see her. I'd be in a box right there in the room, and she wouldn't know. I wondered if you had a desire to bark or laugh when someone who doesn't know walks by the box you're in. Maybe she would have a spell with her heart if I did that and would die right there. The officers and the elevator man and Mr. Grammage would find us. "Funny doggone thing happened at the building last night," the doorman would say to his wife. "I let in this woman to clean up 10F and she never come out, see? She's never in there more than an hour, but she never come out, see? So when it got time for me to go off duty, why, I says to Krennic, who was on the elevator, I says, 'What the hell you suppose has happened to that woman cleans 10F?' He says he didn't know. He says he never seen her after he took her up. So I spoke to Mr. Grammage about it. 'I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Grammage,' I says, 'but there's something funny about that woman cleans 10F. So I told him. So he said we better have a look, and we all three goes up and knocks on the door and rings the bell, see, and nobody answers. So he said we'd have to walk in. So Krennic opened the door, and we walked in, and here was this woman, cleans the apartment, dead as a herring on the floor, and the gentleman that lives there was in a box." The cleaning woman kept looking at me. It was hard to realize she wasn't dead. It's a form of escape, I murmured. What say? She asked, dully. You don't know of any large packing boxes, do you? I asked. No, I don't, she said. I haven't found one yet, but I still have this overpowering urge to hide in a box. Maybe it will go away. Maybe I'll be all right. Maybe it will get worse. It's hard to say. A Box to Hide In by James Thurber. And I don't know when I Went to Sullivan became my father's favorite Thurber story. I suspect it was in the hospital when I was reading to him in the last 6 months of his life. I know I read it to him at least half a dozen times, the first 5 by his request. The last time, he did not request it. In fact, and this is the most perverse kind of compliment I think any writer has ever received, I read this story to him. It was the last thing that I read to him. In fact, it was the last thing he did on earth, was to listen to this story in a state of semi-consciousness. He waited till the end of it. He took one deep, satisfied breath, and he died. I don't recommend this, but I think it does speak to the quality of the writing. I Went to Sullivan by James Thurber. I was reminded the other morning, by what I don't remember, and it doesn't matter, of a crisp September morning last year when I went to the Grand Central to see a little boy of 10 get excitedly on a special coach that was to take him to a boys' school somewhere north of Boston. He had never been away to school before. The coach was squirming with youngsters. You could tell after a while the novitiates, shining and tremulous and a little awed, from the more aloof boys who had been away to school before. But they were very much alike at first glance. There was, for me, in case you thought I was leading up to that, no sharp feeling of old lost years in the tense atmosphere of that coach, because I never went away to a private school when I was a little boy. I went to Sullivan School in Columbus. I thought about it as I walked back to my hotel. Sullivan was an ordinary public school, and yet it was not like any other I have ever known of. In seeking an adjective to describe the Sullivan School of my years, 1900 and 1908, I can only think of tough. Sullivan School was tough. The boys of Sullivan came mostly from the region around Central Market, a poorish district with many families of the laboring class. The school district also included a number of homes of the upper classes because at the turn of the century, 1 or 2 old residential streets still lingered near the shouting and rumbling of the market, reluctant to surrender their fine old houses to the encroaching rabble of commerce and become, as alas they now have, more vulgar business streets. I remember always, first of all, the Sullivan baseball team. Most grammar school baseball teams are made up of boys in the 7th and 8th grades, or they were in my day, but with Sullivan it was different. Several of its best players were in the 4th grade, known to the teachers of the school as the terrible 4th. In that grade you first encountered fractions and long division, and many pupils lodged there for years, like logs in a brook. Some of the more able baseball players had been in the 4th grade for 7 or 8 years. Then, too, there were a number of boys who had not been in the class past the normal time, but were nevertheless deep into their teens. They had avoided starting to school by eluding the truant officer until they were ready to go into long pants, but he always got them in the end. 1 or 2 of these 4th graders were 17 or 18 years old, but the dean of the squad was a tall, husky young man of 22 who was in the 5th grade. The teachers of the 3rd and 4th had got tired of having him around as the years rolled along and had pushed him on. His name was Dana Waney, and he had a mustache. Don't ask me why his parents allowed him to stay in school so long. There were many mysteries at Sullivan that were never cleared up. All I know is why he kept on in school and didn't go to work. He liked playing on the baseball team, and he had a pretty easy time in class because the teachers had given up asking him any questions at all years before. The story was that he had answered but one question in the 17 years he had been going to classes at Sullivant, and that was, what is one use of the comma? The commie, said Dana, embarrassedly unsnarling his long legs from beneath a desk much too low for him, is used to shoot marbles with. Commies was our word for those cheap 10 for a cent marbles, in case it wasn't yours. The Sullivant School baseball team of 1905 defeated several high school teams in the city and claimed the high school championship of the state, to which title it had, of course, no technical right. I believe the boys could have proved their moral right to the championship, however, if they had been allowed to go out of town and play all the teams they challenged, such as the powerful Dayton and Toledo Nines. But their road season was called off after a terrific fight that occurred during one game at Mount Sterling, or Piqua, or Xenia. I can't remember which. Our first baseman, Dana Waney, crowned the umpire with a bat during an altercation over a called strike, and the fight was on. It took place in the fourth inning, so of course the game was never finished. The battle continued on down into the business section of the town and raged for hours with much destruction of property. But since Sullivant was ahead at the time 17-0, there could have been no doubt as to the outcome. Nobody was killed. All of us boys were sure our team could have beaten Ohio State University that year, but they wouldn't play us. They were scared. Waney was by no means the biggest or toughest guy on the grammar school team. He was merely the oldest, being about a year the senior of Floyd, the center fielder, who could jump 5 feet straight into the air without taking a running start. Nobody knew, not even the Board of Education, which once tried to find out whether Floyd was Floyd's first name or his last name. He apparently only had one. He didn't have any parents, and nobody, including himself, seemed to know where he lived. When teachers insisted that he must have another name to go with Floyd, he would grow sullen and ominous, and they would cease questioning him because he was a dangerous scholar in a schoolroom brawl, as Mr. Harrigan, the janitor, found out one morning when he was called in by a screaming teacher. All our teachers were women, to get Floyd under control after she had tried to whip him, and he had begun to take the room apart, beginning with the desks. Floyd broke into small pieces the switch she had used on him. Some said he also ate it. I don't know, because I was homesick at the time with mumps or something. Harrigan was a burly, iron-muscled janitor, a man come from a long line of coal shovelers, but he was no match for Floyd, who had, to be sure, the considerable advantage of being more aroused than Mr. Harrigan when their fight started. Floyd had him down and was sitting on his chest in no time, and Harrigan had to promise to be good and to say, "That's what I get," 10 times before Floyd would let him up. I don't suppose I would ever have got through Sullivant School alive if it hadn't been for Floyd. For some reason, he appointed himself my protector, and I needed one. If Floyd was known to be on your side, nobody in the school would dare be after you and chase you home. I was one of the 10 or 15 male pupils in Sullivant School who always, or almost always, knew their lessons. And I believe Floyd admired the mental prowess of a youngster who knew how many continents there were and whether or not the sun was inhabited. Also, one time when it came to be my turn to read to the class, we used to take turns reading American history aloud, I came across the word Duquesne and knew how to pronounce it. That charmed Floyd, who had been slouched in his seat idly following the printed page of his worn and penciled textbook. "How you know that was Duquesne, boy?" he asked me after class. "I don't know," I said. "I just knew it." He looked at me with round eyes. "Boy, that's something," he said. After that, word got around that Floyd would beat the tar out of anybody that messed around with me. I wore glasses from the time I was 8, and I knew my lessons, and both of those things were considered pretty terrible at Sullivant. Floyd had one idiosyncrasy, though. In the early 1900s, long, warm, furry gloves that came almost to your elbows were popular with boys, and Floyd had one of the biggest pairs in school. He wore them the year round. Dick Peterson was an even greater figure on the baseball team and in the school than Floyd was. He had a way in the classroom of blurting out a long, deep, rolling B-A for no reason at all. Once he licked 3 boys his own size single-handed, really single-handed, for he fought with his right hand and held a mandolin in his left hand all the time. It came out uninjured. Dick and Floyd never met in mortal combat, so nobody ever knew which one could beat, and the scholars were about evenly divided in their opinions. Many a fight started among them after school when the argument came up. I think school never let out at Sullivan without at least one fight starting up, and sometimes there were as many as 5 or 6 raging between the corner of Oak and 6th Streets and the corner of Rich and 4th Streets 4 blocks away. Now and again, virtually the whole school turned out to fight the Catholic boys of the Holy Cross Academy in 5th Street near town for no reason at all. In winter with snowballs and ice balls, in other seasons with fists, brickbats, and clubs. Dick Peterson was always in the van, yelling, singing, B-I-ing, whirling all the way around when he swung with his right, or if he hadn't brought his mandolin, his left, and missed. He made himself the pitcher on the baseball team because he was the captain. He was the captain because everybody else was afraid to challenge his self-election, except Floyd. Floyd was too lazy to pitch, and he didn't care who was captain because he didn't fully comprehend what that meant. On one occasion, when Earl Baddock, a steamfitter's son, had shut out Mound Street School for 6 innings without a hit, Dick took him out of the pitcher's box and went in himself. He was hit hard and the other team scored, but it didn't make much difference because the margin of Sullivan's victory was so great. The team didn't lose a game for 5 years to another grammar school. When Dick Peterson was in the 6th grade, he got into a saloon brawl and was killed. When I go back to Columbus, I always walk past Sullivan School. I have never happened to get there when classes were letting out, so I don't know what the pupils are like now. I am sure there are no more Dick Petersons and no more Floyds, unless Floyd is still going to school there. The play yard is still entirely bare of grass and covered with gravel, and the sycamores still line the curb between the schoolhouse fence and the Oak Street car line. A street car line running past a schoolhouse is a dangerous thing as a rule, but I remember no one being injured while I was attending Sullivan. I do remember, however, one person who came very near being injured. He was a motorman on the Oak Street line, and once when his car stopped at the corner of 6th to let off passengers, he yelled at Chudy Davidson, who played third base on the ball team and was a member of the terrible 4th, to get out of the way. Chudy was 14 years old but huge for his age, and he was standing on the tracks taking a chew of tobacco. "Come on down off of that car and I'll knock your block off," said Chudy in what I can only describe as a Sullivan tone of voice. The motorman waited until Chudy moved slowly off the tracks. Then he went on about his business. I think it was lucky for him that he did. There were boys in those days. I Went to Sullivan by James Thurber. Thurber House, Columbus, Ohio. I don't know, maybe we can put out another book, audio book of Thurber stories. I did one. It's available where audiobooks are available. I don't think it's on iTunes. It's called the Thurber Audio Collection. I don't think you can find it using my name, but it's there. They get all the money. Anyway, I've done all the damage I can do here. More on Thurber later as I think of it. Thanks for listening. Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel, the musical directors of Countdown, arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards. Mr. Ray was on the guitars, bass, and drums. It was produced by TKO Brothers. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by the best baseball stadium organist ever, Nancy Faust. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Other music arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. My announcer today was my friend Kenny Mayne. Everything else was, as ever, my fault. Kenny and I are not running for president. That's countdown for today, just 1,413 days until the scheduled end of his lame duck, lame-brained term, unless Musk replaces him sooner, or the actuarial tables do. The next scheduled countdown is Thursday. As always, bulletins as the news warrants. Remember, impeach Trump. It won't work now. It will win the Democrats the midterms, if there are midterms. And in the interim, put your paddles away and get out your canes and keep protesting. Till next time, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.